All right, thank you for joining us today. We will begin our webinar on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and whether Russia is committing genocide. We will start with a brief introduction on the causes of the Russian invasion, and then we will turn to our speakers who will present the research prepared by the New Lines Institute and Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Follow that, we'll have a discussion incorporating questions from the audience. So please write your questions in the Q&A. In February of 2022, Russia carried out a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. To understand the causes and tactics of the invasion, we need to remember that Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, right after the Ukrainian Maidan Revolution. Ukrainian Revolution was a grassroots movement that brought 4 million participants, 4 million of Ukrainians to the capital to oppose police brutality against peaceful protesters. But as the state repression intensified, the revolutionary movement prevailed, succeeding at ousting then President Yanukovych and restoring democracy, including freedom of expression. Democratic elections followed the revolution, choosing democratically parliament and several rounds of presidents. However, democracy in Ukraine, and especially Ukrainians' willingness to risk their life for it, presents a problem for the Kremlin, because it minimized its ability to control Ukraine. Controlling Ukraine has been Putin's ideological obsession, and he openly denied Ukrainian statehood for years. During and after the revolution, Russia unleashed an aggressive propaganda against Ukraine, painting the democratic movement as a coup and an American conspiracy against Russia. Only a few days after the Ukrainian Revolution, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed Crimea. Coups were carried out in eastern Ukraine with the aid of the Russian special forces. They succeeded only in 2 cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, and 2 areas of Ukraine around these 2 cities was de facto controlled by Russia since 2014. Russian propaganda, Russian aggressive propaganda after that only intensified and continued. Russian propaganda dehumanizes Ukrainians. It claims that Ukrainian government is undemocratic and is just a puppet of the West. Therefore, Ukrainians are presented as inferior who cannot rule themselves. And in fact, Russian propaganda, Russian officials constantly deny the existence of the Ukrainian state. They constantly denied Ukrainian identity. In February of 2022, Russia carried out a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Not only Russia violated Ukrainian sovereignty, but it targeted civilian areas, apartment buildings, hospitals, schools. Russian forces carried out mass executions and mass rapes. Thousands of children were forcefully deported to Russia. Moreover, Russian forces specifically targeted cultural sites of Ukraine. They destroyed Ukrainian history books and are forcing education in Russian language in the occupied areas. So, as we are watching these numerous atrocities and the attempt to erase Ukrainian culture, the question arises, is Russia committing genocide in Ukraine? And today we have our special guests, legal scholars who will present research conducted by the New Lines Institute and Raoul Wallenberg Center of Human Rights. And our first presenter, Dr. Azeem Ibrahim, is a director of special initiatives at the New Lines Institute. He's also an adjunct research professor at Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge. He was International Security Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, as well as World Fellow at Yale. Over the years, he met and advised world leaders, and he was ranked top 100 global thinker by the European Social Think Tank in 2010. He was also ranked Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. It is therefore an honor and a pleasure to introduce Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you so much for being with us, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for that very kind introduction, and thank you so much to the University of Southern Illinois, Edwardsville, for hosting this event. So let me start off just by saying that the word genocide is often used very loosely, and it's often used interchangeably with mass murder, mass atrocities. You know, people say, well, look, this country is committing genocide against this people, and we are victims of genocide from so and so. But the actual word genocide has a very precise definition, a very precise legal definition, and that definition is articulated in the 1948 Genocide Convention, where it says very clearly that genocide is all about intent, the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. So the quantity of the people being killed, the quantity of the people being persecuted is of no relevance at all. You could kill 1 million people, you can kill one person. It does not make one a genocide above the other. Now, let me just give you a very quick background to our report from the New Lines Institute with the Raoul Wallenberg Centre. So we put together the most extensive and detailed examination of whether Russia has breached the 1948 Genocide Convention with its actions in Ukraine. And earlier this year, after Russia invaded Ukraine, I was invited to Ukraine by the Ministry of Health. This was in late March, early April, to come and do an undertaking, an examination of what's going on there on the ground in terms of Russian atrocities being committed. The reason I was invited by the Ukrainian government was because of our previous report on the Uyghur genocide. So a year before, we had put out a report also by the New Lines Institute and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre, looking at whether the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, was committing genocide against the Uyghur population. We examined extensive evidence, internal documents and speeches by Xi Jinping, satellite imagery and so on. And we had over 50 of the top legal experts in the world do an undertaking and analysis whether China was committing genocide against the Uyghurs. And our conclusion was that China is engaged in a full-scale genocide against the Uyghur population. And once again, as I mentioned, it's all down to intent. So based on that, the Ukrainian government decided to invite me through an intermediary to come and visit Ukraine and undertake a similar examination. So I spent a number of days there speaking to various witnesses, taking testimonials, traveling around the area. And when I returned back to the United States, the New Lines Institute and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre, we assembled teams of experts, 3 teams of experts. The first team of experts were open source intelligence experts. The first team of experts were open source intelligence experts who looked at the satellite imagery. We looked at telegram channels, translations, etc. The second team of experts were language experts that can translate a lot of the material that was going through. And the third team of experts were legal scholars, scholars of the highest international repute. So these were former ICC, ICJ judges, former attorney generals, justice ministers, former ambassadors, so people of the utmost highest caliber. And once they had assessed all the evidence that we could possibly put together, and some of this evidence was not available in the public domain, some of it we had to translate and put it together, the conclusion they came to was that Russia was in clear breach of the Genocide Convention. and that Russia bears state responsibility for inciting to commit genocide against the Ukrainian people. Now, this is very important, the conclusion of this and how we approached it, and the conclusion we came to is extremely important, because what we did say, the report states unequivocally, after examining all the evidence, is that Russia is inciting genocide in Ukraine. So we do not say that there is a full-scale genocide. So that may be the case. There may be a genocide going on, but on the evidence available, we say that Russia is inciting genocide. Russia's war in Ukraine is genocidal in nature. Now, this is extremely important, this distinction, and it's usually lost on a lot of people, even scholars of extreme caliber. It's usually lost on them. So, and I'll talk about that very shortly. But it's essentially, the conclusion we came to is that Russia is intent on destroying Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And when we look at the evidence, for example, we say that Russia does not recognize Ukraine. So they do not recognize Ukraine as an independent nation. So, for example, and our report obviously has extensive evidence of this, but just to give you an example, in July 2021, Putin himself penned an essay saying that Ukraine is an artificial creation. And we have testimony from the leaders in Russia, for example, one of the chairs of the very powerful Duma committees, saying that there is no Ukraine, there is no Ukrainianness. This is a disorder of the mind. There is no nation. And then we can also see these words being translated into action by the Russian troops on the ground. For example, 180,000 Ukrainian children were forcibly displaced, forcibly transferred from Ukraine into Russia, and they were dispersed so that they cannot coalesce as a single identity group. So essentially eliminating their Ukrainianness. We also have extensive evidence, which my colleague Emily will go through, on Russians raping Ukrainian women so that they do not want to have Ukrainian children anymore. And these are actual words from the Russian soldiers themselves. So genocide, Russia's actions, the evidence bears, is all about intent. And this is what distinguishes it from all other crimes against humanity, war crimes, etc. It's all about intent. It's the intention to wipe out Ukrainian identity, wipe out Ukraine as a nation, in whole or in part. And this intention can be attributed to the state, so the Russian Federation, and through its general pattern, so general plan that they have, and through official documents, and just through the systematic pattern of atrocities, that all the pattern of atrocities points towards the intention to wipe out Ukrainianness and to wipe out Ukraine as a nation and absorb it within Greater Russia. Now, why did we decide to pursue, rather than saying this is a genocide and not, why did we decide to say that this is genocidal intent, serious risk of genocide, and not come out and just say, well, look, it's clear that this is a genocide? Now, this is very important because my colleague Emily and I have been working on a lot of these issues for quite some time. We've done extensive work on the Rohingya genocide. We've done extensive work on the Uyghur genocide. And in all of these questions, we find it is not very helpful to call something a genocide, because what that does is that it moves the debate onto whether something actually qualifies as a genocide or not. So even among scholars, academics, policymakers, the debate then becomes, well, is this a genocide or not? Has it met the threshold of genocide? And that we find is not very helpful. So instead, we focused on the Genocide Convention, the purpose of which, of the Genocide Convention, is to prevent and punish. The punish always comes after. The purpose, the primary purpose of the Genocide Convention is to prevent genocide. And once the trigger of serious risk of genocide has been met, the duty then falls upon all international states, all states that are signatory to the Genocide Convention, all 151 of them, to do everything in their power, politically, economically, diplomatically, culturally, use every single lever at their disposal to prevent a full-scale genocide. So the obligation is thus on the states to prevent genocide. Whereas if you say that there is a genocide, then the discussion becomes about punishment. So who's responsible for this genocide? Who are the decision makers? How do we arrest them? How do we have a tribunal? And it moves on from actually preventing. So our report focuses very strongly and exclusively on the serious risk of genocide. The threshold has been met. And so the obligation is on all international states that signatories to the Genocide Convention, including the Russian Federation, to do whatever they can. And that means countries have to suspend trading relationships with Russia. They have to suspend cultural relationships. They have to do everything, use all the tools at their disposal to put pressure on the Russian Federation. So to answer the question, is Russia committing a genocide in Ukraine? The answer would be possibly, maybe, but that is not what we are focusing on. We are focusing on Russia's genocidal intent. We are focusing on breaches of the Genocide Convention, and we are focusing on prevention of genocide. Prevention, so intervention by the international community to stop it spilling over into a full-scale genocide. We have, through our lifetime, heard so many times, never again, whether it's Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo, the Uyghurs, Rohingya, and then every time we say yet again. And then every time policymakers will tell you that, oh, look, we really didn't know what was going on until after the fact. And historians will tell you this is simply not correct. Everybody knows what's going on. And in this occasion, we have provided the evidence, we translated it into 13 languages, we presented it to parliaments and leaders throughout the globe. So everybody is fully cognizant of what is going on. So the obligation is on all states to uphold the Genocide Convention, which primary function is to prevent genocide. And with that, I'll pass it back on to the chair. Sophia, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim, for this such an insightful presentation. So it is my pleasure now to present Emily Prey, who is a senior analyst at Special Initiatives at the New Lines Institute. She's a gender expert specializing in genocide and transitional justice. She specializes and research on child marriage, human trafficking, and transitional justice. She has a master's degree with law and diplomacy from Fletcher School at Tufts University. She's also a former project manager of the Financial Integration and Displacement Initiative of the International Rescue Committee, and she previously worked with the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. So therefore, it is my great honor and pleasure to present Emily Prey, and she will talk today about to us about the gender aspect of genocide.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and thank you for having us here today. It's always great to have a platform to speak about the findings of our report and the issue of genocide in Ukraine. So I'm going to give a brief overview of how genocide is a gendered crime and why it's so important to pay attention to this, and then get into some examples of how Russian forces are using sexual and gender-based violence as a method of war. So I think one of my favorite quotes, or not favorite, I guess one of the most powerful quotes that I've come across is by Susan Brown Miller. And she wrote that man's discovery that his genitalia could serve as a weapon to generate fear must rank as one of the most important discoveries of prehistoric times, along with the use of fire and the first crude stone axe. And I think that that's really relevant here. And we've seen that in every conflict, in most conflicts that I've come across. So as my colleague Azeem mentioned, under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, there are 5 genocidal acts, and it's really important to note that only one of them is mass killing. But despite this, the world continues to privilege the act of killing over other non-lethal genocidal acts. And colloquially, genocide is understood as mass killing, as Azeem detailed. But these non-lethal acts can include, but are not limited to, the forcible separation of children from their families to break familial bonds, rape and sexual violence, and inflicting conditions of life intended to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part, like military sieges and destroying infrastructure and vital healthcare facilities, and deliberate attacks on shelters and humanitarian corridors, all of which we have seen in Ukraine and which we cover in our report. So typically when a genocide occurs, men are more likely to be victims of mass killing, while women are more likely to be victims of these non-lethal genocidal acts like rape or sexual torture. And we're seeing this in Ukraine as well. And so while men are also victims of non-lethal acts, their stories, like those of women, are often overlooked or ignored and are not recognized by prosecutors after the fact. And so the vast majority of survivors of genocide will never receive justice simply because they are viewed less as victims and more as survivors. And perpetrators of genocide have an understanding of gender, whether they're cognizant of it or not, because they target their victims based on gender and based on their roles in society. And so women are targeted for their roles as mothers and wives and bearers of children who continue on the family line, and their bodies are frequently targeted in order to send a message to the men of their community of their powerlessness and their impotence. And so women, specifically their sexual and reproductive organs, are always targeted in genocides, and the war in Ukraine is no exception. And if anything of what I just said is interesting to you, I encourage you to read the Global Justice Center's report, Beyond Killing, and New Line's report, Gender and Genocide in the 21st Century, both of which go into much more detail on this topic. So to look at the real world for an example of why this is so important, we can look at the Uyghur Tribunal that took place last year in the UK, which examined allegations of genocide against the Uyghur minority in China, as to why a gendered view is so important. So the tribunal came to the judgment that violations of the Genocide Convention did in fact occur because of the measures put in place by the CCP intended to prevent births within the group. So that includes sexual violence against Uyghurs, forced sterilizations of Uyghurs, purposefully separating Uyghur men from women, and other such methods intended to decrease the population over time. It was because of this non-lethal genocidal act, the prevention of births within the group, because of the gendered way in which the CCP is carrying out this genocide by targeting, in large part, the sexual and reproductive organs of Uyghur women and men, that a judgment of genocide was found in that case. So, as Azeem said, what is really important to understand is that genocide is not a crime of scale. It's not a crime of killing. It is a crime of intent. And without a full understanding of how gender interacts with genocide, the international community and the 152 signatories to the Genocide Convention are ill-equipped to effectively do their duty under international law to prevent and to punish this crime. Now, looking at Ukraine, and just as a heads up, some of this will be quite graphic. I don't doubt that Russian soldiers were raping and sexually assaulting civilians from the very start of the war, but we only began to hear reports of the sexual violence and torture as a method of war after Russians withdrew their forces from certain areas, and then people were able to come forward and tell their stories. But these types of crimes, these gender-based crimes, are often brushed to the side or not taken as seriously as other crimes, which is why it was so important in our New Line's Wallenberg report that we dedicated a section to sexual violence and rape, which shows how rape can be indicative of genocidal intent. And we'll never know the true numbers of the victims of sexual violence during this war, but the accounts that we have heard and that we read about are staggering and do exhibit the possibility of genocidal intent. Early on in the war, Ukraine's former ombudswoman Lyudmila Denisova reported that Russian soldiers held a group of Ukrainian women and girls in a basement for 25 days and raped them, telling them, "We will rape you until you do not want to have sexual contact with another man to prevent you from having Ukrainian children." And in June, she also reported that a 6-month-old child was raped by a Russian soldier. In the same town, 5 Russian soldiers held down a mother while they gang raped her twin sons, who were 2 years old and died later of their wounds. So rape is very clearly a method of war. It has nothing to do with sexual pleasure and everything to do with power and control. And it doesn't only happen to women and girls. It never does. There's always more victims. We've heard accounts of young boys being raped while their parents are forced to watch. And there are recordings that the Security Service of Ukraine intercepted of conversations between a Russian soldier and his wife, where the wife tells her husband, "Go ahead and rape as many Ukrainian women as you can. Just make sure to use contraception so you don't bring anything back." So this is not just a few rogue actors or some bad apples. This is systematic. And this shows how rape can be used to terrorize a population into submission, and how rape and sexual violence can be indicative of genocidal intent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing the research that was done. It is very hard to hear these stories, but nevertheless, it reminds us how important it is for us to hear and learn about it. So here, I would like to encourage the audience to send questions via Q&A that you see at the bottom of your screen. I will start, I will lead with a few questions. My first question is that the report that was prepared was issued in May of this year. A lot has happened since then. The evidence that out of what happened, do you see evidence that perhaps contradicts or, on the other hand, supports conclusions of your report?
Thanks so much for that, Sophia. Yeah, so our report, it did come out in May. We were thinking of doing an update, an addendum. It came out quite early on in the course of the conflict. Since that time, many areas have been liberated from the Russian occupation. The Ukrainians have been substantially more successful than anybody had anticipated, including our own intelligence agencies. And as the areas have been liberated, we have seen evidence of further atrocities, just simply reconfirms our thesis. We have seen mass graves, we have seen rape camps, we have seen more evidence of the whole idea of trying to wipe out Ukrainianness, which is essentially what genocidal intent is all about. It's wiping out the identity of the people, so not necessarily just the people themselves, but wiping out their identity, making sure it disappears. And so all the evidence that's coming out from areas that are being liberated reinforces our central argument, and I think this will certainly continue for the foreseeable future. And when once we see that all of Ukraine has been fully liberated, I think, and then we have a much more extensive evidence gathering phase, I think it will be concluded very quickly that what Russia undertook in Ukraine was genocide, and I think that will be further reinforced as the Russians are pushed back.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. And another question that I had, it builds on your answer, and a lot of people around the world were surprised to see Russian invasion, and more specifically, many saw Russian and Ukrainian identity as similar. And most importantly, very often Russian propaganda asserts that Russian and Ukrainians, they are all the same. And therefore, lots of people conclude, well, maybe then it's not a genocide. And your research clarifies that. And so I wanted, if possible, for you to speak more about why this Russian propaganda language of saying that Russians and Ukrainians are the same actually helps us understand that it's genocidal intent rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I think if you look at Russian propaganda, which is very effective, Russia is no longer a superpower, but then when it comes to the information sphere, when it comes to the disinformation sphere, they are world leaders in that domain. And if you look closely at the propaganda, it doesn't necessarily say that Russians and Ukrainians are the same. What it does say is that the Ukrainians are Russian, and Ukraine is just an artificial construct, it's an artificial country, and they are all actually Russians. So they are all just simply returning to their motherland, which is once again reinforces the genocidal argument. And it's very interesting because in the region, if you look at the countries in the region who kind of have a very thorough understanding of what's going on and what Russia was up to, you mentioned, Sophia, how this invasion came as a surprise. It certainly did. It came as a surprise to many countries who anticipated that, well, look, this was all just bluff and bluster from Putin. It was only a handful of countries that anticipated what Putin was actually up to. And all of those countries were the countries in the region, countries that know Russia, they know Putin, and they knew exactly what he was up to. Countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Czech, Poland, all former Soviet states, they knew exactly what Putin was actually up to. And so I don't think it came as a surprise to everybody necessarily. Certainly, I think many of the other bigger European countries, France, Germany, and Italy in particular, they were very hopeful that this would just be some more grandstanding from Putin. And I think this is an important lesson, because you should always listen to countries that are in the region and not necessarily, come before you come to your own conclusions. And we've seen a very similar thing. For example, I'll give you a very good example of this, is when the coronavirus was first exposed to the world. We had the World Health Organization reiterating Chinese talking points about how there's no human-to-human transfer, there's no reason to shut down travel from Wuhan, etc. But all the countries in the region did the exact opposite. They did, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, they knew exactly what the Communist Party in China was doing. And all the countries in the West continued and took everything at face value from the Chinese government. So countries in the region always have a much better understanding of what's going on. And it's exactly the same situation here. All the countries that are part of the Soviet Union have taken the strongest stance on this, because they know exactly what was going on. They knew that even our intelligence agencies anticipated that Putin does invade Ukraine, it will be over in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, he'd have installed a puppet government in Kyiv and absorbed it into Greater Russia. And then, depending on the reaction of the West, which he anticipated and many others anticipated, would be simply just very weak, then there's absolutely no doubt he would have went further afield, looking at Moldova, looking at Latvia, looking at Estonia, looking at all the other countries, even possibly NATO countries, knowing that NATO is not going to react. So none of this is a surprise to a lot of those countries who knew that they're in the firing line of Putin's aggression. They have seen wars, many of them in their own lifetimes. Many of those leaders have seen wars like this in their lifetimes, and they know what happens when an ambitious leader like Putin emerges from Europe, who wants to expand his territorial ambitions.
Yes, thank you very much for the detailed answer. I will ask one more question, and then I'll channel the questions from the audience. Thank you very much for sending those questions. One of the very important parts of your report talked about that very important aspect of Russia's state orchestrated incitement to genocide is the so-called accusation in a mirror. In your report, it said that accusation in a mirror is a powerful, historically recurring form of incitement to genocide. So I wanted you to explain a little bit more of that, why it is why this accusation in the mirror helps us understand the genocidal nature of the Russian invasion.
Yeah, so accusation. Sorry, go ahead, Emily.
Oh, sorry. I can take a little bit of this one. We found in the report that there's a campaign to incite genocide from the very top of the Kremlin downwards, and Article 2C of the Genocide Convention provides for the distinct punishable or wrongful act of direct and public incitement to commit genocide. And so this is all happening against the backdrop of intense media restrictions, where foreign media and certain social media sites have been banned from Russia. So people are really just getting their news from state propaganda mouthpieces. And so then Putin is able to control the messages going out and what Russians are hearing inside, which is that Ukraine is a Nazi state and that the invasion was justified because Ukraine was committing genocide against the Russians, which is accusation in a mirror. And so this really, what Russia is doing is posing Ukraine as a whole, including the Ukrainian people, as an existential threat to Russia. And so if Ukraine continues to exist as it is, then Russia itself will somehow cease to exist. And I have some examples, some excerpts from our report, which kind of exhibit the propaganda that Russia is using and sharing to its people. On April 5th, the Security Council Deputy Chairman Dmitry Medvedev posted on Telegram that Ukraineness, which is fueled by anti-Russian poison and is consumed by the lie concerning its own identity, this is all one big fake. This phenomenon has never existed in history, and it does not exist now. And that's exactly what Azeem was saying before, that Ukraineness doesn't exist. Everyone is just Russian. And then a few days after the invasion, an essay was published on a Kremlin-controlled platform, which praised Putin for deciding not to leave the solution of the Ukrainian question to future generations, which really evokes Nazi propaganda of the final solution. And then lastly, on March 26th, the propagandist said that it's no accident we call them Nazis. What makes you a Nazi is your bestial nature, your bestial hatred, and your bestial willingness to tear out the eyes of children on the basis of nationality. And a significant part of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian people, turned out to be in the grip of Nazi frenzy. So this overwhelming campaign of propaganda conditions the Russian people to accept and condone and even encourage the atrocities taking place because they see them as defensive measures against a Nazi state and a state that is committing genocide. So that is why we came to the conclusion in our report that there is reasonable grounds that we definitively conclude that there's a serious risk of genocide taking place. But as you can see from this evidence, there is reasonable grounds to conclude there is a genocide taking place.
All right, thank you so much for that answer. Here, one of the first questions we received is, and it is answered in your report, but here's a great opportunity to talk about it. So the question, I said the global news media might have a different perception of genocide, as we talked about ethnically, there are presumptions about sort of the sameness between Ukraine and Russia. So how can the sense of Ukrainianness be defined and reiterated in global media to countervail this propagandized perception? And so how, in your report, you clearly addressed that from legal point of view. And if you could address that here.
Yeah, I think that question should be directed towards the Ukrainian people. Do they feel that they are distinctive from the Russians, or do they feel that they are actually Russians themselves? And I think most of them will say that they have a very distinctive history, very distinctive culture, very distinctive language, different way of life from the Russians. Certainly it was part of the Soviet Union, but as were many other countries. But that is just a very small segment of history. They see themselves as completely distinctive. They see themselves as an independent nation, democratic nation. It's recognised internationally with a seat at the United Nations, and so they're completely independent of the Russian Federation. So ethnically, they may be similar, but as is much of Europe, I don't think that's relevant at all to this discussion. They see the Ukrainian people see themselves as completely distinctive, and they see themselves as being aggressed upon by the Russian Federation that's trying to absorb it into its sphere. So I'm not sure how relevant that question is. I think that's it should be directed to the Ukrainian people. Do you see yourself as Russian or Ukrainian? And all the Ukrainians that I have met, and I've met a considerable amount over the last year, I don't think any of them will say that we identify ourselves anywhere near as being Russian. They have very proud history, a proud tradition, and so a completely distinctive group.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I wanted to add just a little bit from the point of view of my research is that ironically, those perceptions are in the world, if they are, and they're certainly disappearing, but if they are still there, it is the result of the aggressive Russian propaganda that reaches out abroad and has been very effective through the Soviet era. That purposefully was creating the message that undermined Ukrainian identity. And so providing for this information vacuum about Ukraine. And absolutely Ukrainians asserted their sovereignty there, assert their culture and language and identity. And absolutely right, as Dr. Ibrahim pointed out, it is very clear. This message needs to be repeated, that this is a very clear message from the Ukrainians as they celebrate their culture and they resist the Russian invasion. Another question here is, does your work look at Russian media's role in creating the context for genocide? Does the evidence show that the soldiers' crime are motivated by hate that they have received from Russian TV? Does the Russian army military actively instruct soldiers in the propaganda that seeks to justify genocidal crimes?
So the propaganda efforts from Russia are extremely effective in terms of dehumanization of the Ukrainian people. So genocide, we always argue, don't happen in a vacuum. They never happen all of a sudden, even though some will argue that, well, we had no idea this was coming and it just came out of nowhere. It usually takes quite a considerable amount of time to dehumanize a people sufficiently that you are able to go out and actually kill civilians and women and children and everything else. It requires quite an extensive effort. And the Russians are, very effective at this. Their propaganda channels, you can see that you mentioned earlier, accusations in a mirror. So this is part of one of the indicators of genocide is that you accuse your opponent of what you are actually intending to do and what you are actually planning to do. So they're referring to Ukrainians, as Nazis. They have been basically telling them, the soldiers, rape the Nazi whores until they don't want to have any other Ukrainian children. So this dehumanization has been going on very extensively in Russia, where many of the other channels have been shut down. So the state propaganda channel is extremely effective at pushing this narrative through that Russia is actually a threat from Ukraine, and hence this was a preemptive war because the Nazis had taken over, and Ukraine was at the brink of invading Russia and committing atrocities against the Russian people. Hence why we had to preempt and attack Ukraine, and it's very effective. We have situations in which Russian dissidents who have fled. Some of the soldiers who fled from the Ukrainian battlefield and managed to get out spoke to the parents, and the parents are completely believe in all the Russian propaganda that's being perpetuated. So the propaganda machine is extremely effective. The disinformation campaigns are very, very effective, and we see this through some of the narratives that we have here in the West. That the kind of questions that people are asking about the invasion and Russia's legitimacy, about some of the brigades the Ukrainian soldiers, the Azov Brigade and others, whether they're actually Nazis, etc. Much of this is just Russian propaganda. This is something that they really do excel in. They obviously militarily have been exposed as being extremely weak, but in the information sphere, they're actually very, very effective.
I also want to add that genocides generally begin with words and with rhetoric. It's, as Azeem said, it doesn't just happen one day like that. This is years and years of priming a population to commit atrocity crimes. And you have to start that by dehumanizing and othering a protected group, because how else would so many regular everyday people be convinced to go along with these types of crimes? And we've seen this in the past of, naming different groups of people cockroaches or rats or subhuman or devils or, any kind of rhetoric like that makes them somehow separate from you. And so then the Russian forces and soldiers are able to do the things that they're doing because they have been so brainwashed by the propaganda and by the rhetoric that the people that they're facing aren't actually people at all.
Yes. Thank you very much for addressing that. Your report talks about mostly about the areas where you were able to have access to, where Russian forces have withdrawn. And there is a reference to Mariupol because Russian forces are still occupying it, but there are satellite images of mass graves, some of them of thousands of people. There also have been reports since then that because of the amounts of people, civilians who were killed in Mariupol by the Russian forces, now after they've taken over, they've been reports from several sources that people are forced, civilians in Mariupol are forced to carry out dead bodies in exchange for water. And just yesterday, civilians were actually exploded on a Russian mine because they were forced to go to the factory as they're essentially being used as a test for mines. Do crimes like that help us understand the genocidal nature of the Russian invasion?
Yeah, so if you want to understand what Russia is doing in Ukraine, we actually have seen this show before. This is nothing new. I've written a number of articles on this as well, as in terms of if you want to have a very thorough understanding of Russian tactics and strategy in Ukraine, all you have to do is look at what they did in Syria, which did not get sufficient amount of coverage. But the exact playbook is very, very similar. They are using the same playbook that they utilized in Syria. In Syria, they did this claiming that their victims were all, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and extremists. But, one of my very good colleagues was the only Western doctor in Syria at the time of the siege of Aleppo. And, he told me that the Russians were just systematically bombing all the hospitals one by one. And one of the hospitals that he was at, they moved it underground into a car park so it couldn't be bombed. And the Russians brought in special bunker buster bombs to target the hospital. So you essentially target all the civilian infrastructure first. And that means water plants, electricity, power plants, hospitals, and make sure that the civilian population is completely squeezed and the civilian population is suffering. And that's before you actually send in the troops. So is a systematic and organized campaign to terrorize the civilian population into submission. Yeah, so we've seen all of this before. Nothing of this is new. It's just unfortunate that in Syria, the international community did not take the appropriate action against Russia. But all these tactics that Russia is using, targeting, we've seen them as well. We've seen the videos of them targeting schools and hospitals and shopping centres in Ukraine. So these are precision weapons. They don't go awry just like that. They are systematically targeting those areas in a coordinated and formal fashion. So everything that you see happening, the use of civilian shields, targeting civilian infrastructure, is all exactly the same thing that they did in Syria, and before that they did that in Chechnya, and so the playbook is exactly the same. So this hasn't, and I follow the Syrian situation quite closely. I went there twice myself during the conflict, and I see myself what was going on. So none of this came as a surprise to me.
Right. So the tactics are not surprising, but the propaganda is different, and that what helps us understand the genocidal nature here, right? Because there is a specific attack on the Ukrainian identity, on the Ukrainian state, and it's sort of constantly repeated, sort of this denial of
yeah. So the intention here is obviously they want to absorb Ukraine into Russia. That was the intention. They wanted to install their puppet government. In Syria, it wasn't necessarily they wanted to absorb Syria, but the propaganda was very similar in terms of all these civilians. They're all ISIS. All of them. The entire town has been taken over by the Nusra Front, ISIS, Al Qaeda, and hence we are just the only targets. People that we are targeting are the ISIS extremists, but in fact it was the civilians' infrastructure that was being targeted. So the propaganda efforts are very similar in terms of dehumanization, and paint in the Ukraine they paint everybody as the Nazis. In Syria they did so as Islamist extremists. So it's very similar from that perspective. The ultimate goal might be different, but the ambition here is to terrorize and subjugate the civilian population into surrender.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And my last question here is that lots of our listeners might not realize that while the battles are going on in the eastern part of the country, there are constant attack on Ukraine by Russian rockets, or at least a threat of them reaching there. And so lots of people so there are sirens going off all the time. And there are a number of cities that are not under occupation, but there's in Kharkiv area, Sumy area, Nikolaev area, where Russian weapons can reach, and they do all the time. And you talked about hospitals just yesterday in beginning of today, they reported that it was a preschool and school and hospital facility that was attacked in Kharkiv. And as a result of this constant threat all over Ukraine, so we're talking about a nation of 42 million people constantly, day and night, live in terror. The sirens can go off 5 times a night. People sleep through the sirens. They have to hide in these horrible conditions that are not even bomb shelters, right? So life has changed, and the people continue to live under that terror and constant threat of being killed, or watch their children being ripped apart or buried alive as a result of the Russian strikes. Does that help us as well, even though these people are not being targeted per se, or they have not been, but there's assumption that they can be, and as a result they live in this terror? Does that help us understand the genocidal aspect?
Yeah. So this war, and I think some of the previous ones, have changed the nature of war. So usually in a conflict situation like this, the battle would be on the front line, with troops are engaging with troops, and if you're far from the front line, you'd be relatively safe and be able to get on with your life. And in fact, the opposite is happening in many of these situations. You're actually much safer on the front line from these rockets because they don't want to hit their own troops. And whereas if you're further away from the front line, you're being bombarded by these missiles and artillery that is being targeted. And as I indicated, there's no strategic or tactical reason to target a preschool or a hospital. It is simply to terrorize the population into submission, to say, well, look, why don't we just, give up? And this is not worth the effort and the sacrifice. Let life return to normal. How bad could it be to be controlled by Moscow? And that is essentially the aim here, is to terrorize and subjugate the population. So all of this fits into the genocidal intent to essentially subjugate the people, to bend them to your will, and simply because you are trying to you're trying to absorb the entirety of the nation into yours. Yeah, so it's very interesting how the nature of war and conflicts have simply just changed. Nowhere is safe. I was there myself. I spent a considerable amount of time in bunkers, and it was very interesting because I was the only man in the bunkers. The rest of them were all women, because all the men had been recruited and were actually on the front line, and it was just women, children, old men, hiding in the bunker, in the bomb shelters. And we just have to periodically, we'd be, meeting with people, and periodically we, have to evacuate to the bunker below the building. So this is all part of the same kind of campaign.
One of the acts of genocide under Article 2 is inflicting conditions of life intended to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part. And so this kind of terrorizing a population into submission can fit under that. And also the trauma that Ukrainians are experiencing, that's not going to stop when the war stops. That's going to be something that they carry and that their children carry. Research has shown that it takes 3 generations to fully overcome a trauma like that. And so that could also have an effect on the Ukrainians as a group, and depending on if they're victims of sexual violence, they might not want to engage in any contact with men in the future. So all of this kind of works together to where you can see Russia's intent here.
Right. Thank you so much to the speakers. And I wanted to end here with the remark that Dr. Ibrahim stated at the beginning, that report is meant as the important message to the state that have a duty to prevent genocide. So when we see genocidal intent, propaganda, and actions that show the genocidal nature of the invasion, it is our duty to try to prevent that. And in a democratic societies, we are the messengers for our states. So we need to learn more about it. We need to understand it and communicate that responsibility to the state. And I wanted to thank all the listeners today who are doing exactly that. They are learning about it, and I thank you for that and encourage you to keep learning. And with that, on October 7th, also at 10 a.m., we will have another panel with scholars who will address the nuclear situation and the threat that comes from Russian actions against nuclear plant in Ukraine, and Russian constant threat to the world to use nuclear weapons. So join us then, and thank you so much again to our esteemed guests who found the time to share such an important research with us. Thank you again, Emily Prey and Azeem Ibrahim.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.